Imagine a big beautiful tree with huge trunk and branches which growed out of it. This image was used by René Guénon to show the relationship between Western and Eastern civilization. Contrary to the conjecture of most Westerners, it is the East that takes the form of a trunk in this simile, while Western civilization takes the form of one of its branches. Interestingly, if we compare what is usually referred to as classical antiquity with the Eastern civilizations, it will readily be seen that, in some respects at least, it has more in common with those civilizations than modern Europe has. The Greek civilization itself is far from possessing the originality ascribed to it by people of restricted vision, who would willingly go to the length of declaring that the Greeks libeled themselves whenever they happened to acknowledge their debt to Egypt, to Phoenicia, to Chaldea, to Persia, and even to India. All these civilizations may well be incomparably more ancient than the Greek, but this doesn't prevent some people blinded by what may be termed the classical prejudice from persistently maintaining the theory in the face of all the evidence that it is those other civilizations that are indebted to the Greek and have felt its influence. Indeed, the study of the East as we know it today, if undertaken in a really direct way, would be of great assistance toward the understanding of all antiquity, and it would even facilitate the understanding of Greek antiquity. It should be remembered, nevertheless, that Greek thought was, in spite of everything, Western in its essence, and that it already contained among its other characteristics the origin and the germ of most of those tendencies which developed much later among the modern Westerners. There is a reason why we talk about Western civilization. It does derive from the East, but it in fact developed such characteristics that makes us acknowledge its separateness. However, in reality, there have been respites in the divergence. There have even been less remote times when the West again received the direct influence of the East. We allude mainly to the Alexandrian period and to the contributions to European thought during the Middle Ages made by the Arabs, some of which were entirely their own, the rest being derived from India. Their influence in the development of mathematics is well known, but it was far from being limited to this particular field. The divergence continued once more with the Renaissance, at which time the rift with the preceding period became very marked. The truth is that this so-called rebirth proved to be the death of many things, even in the arts, but above all, in an intellectual sense. We also have already indicated what we mean by the classical prejudice. It consists essentially in a predisposition to attribute the origin of all civilization to the Greeks and Romans. It seems scarcely possible to account for this attitude except by means of the following explanation. Because their own civilization hardly goes any further back than the Greco-Roman period and derives for the most part from it, Westerners are led to believe that it must have been the same in every other case, and they have difficulty in conceiving of the existence of entirely different and far more ancient civilizations. It might be said that they are mentally incapable of crossing the Mediterranean. To the impartial observer, it is plain that the Greeks, from the intellectual point of view at least, really borrowed very largely from the Easterners, as they themselves frequently admitted. Their originality principally lay in the manner of expressing things, by means of a faculty for adaptation one cannot deny them, but which was necessarily limited by the extent of their comprehension. It cannot even be said that Greek reasoning is distinguished by an exceptional strictness. It only appears stricter than other methods of reasoning to people who are themselves in the habit of employing it exclusively, and this illusion is due solely to the fact that it is restricted to a narrower and more limited field, and is therefore more easily defined. On the contrary, the faculty most truly characteristic of the Greeks, but which is little to their advantage, is a certain dialectical subtlety, of which the dialogues of Plato provide numerous examples. There is an apparent desire to examine each question interminably, under all its aspects and in minutest detail, in order to arrive finally at a rather insignificant conclusion. It would appear that in the West the moderns are not the people to have been afflicted with intellectual myopia. It is easier to agree with all of that if one considers what Westerners are capable of today, when they happen to come into direct contact with certain Eastern conceptions and set about interpreting them in a manner of conforming to their own particular mentality. Anything they cannot connect with the classical idiom escapes them completely, and whatever can be made to tally with it is so disfigured in the process that it becomes almost unrecognizable. It matters little, moreover, whether the Greeks were or were not more successful than others in turning certain forms of knowledge to practical use, or whether they deduced consequences of this particular kind, whereas those who preceded them did not do so. It might even be said that, in this respect, they assigned a less pure and disinterested purpose to knowledge, because their turn of mind only allowed them to remain within the domain of principles with some difficulty and as though by exception. This inclination toward the practical, in the most ordinary sense of the word, is one of those factors that were fated to become increasingly marked during the course of Western civilization, until in modern times the tendency became frankly predominant. Only the Middle Ages, being much more given to pure speculation, can be said to have escaped it. As general rule, Westerners have very little natural aptitude for metaphysics. A comparison of their languages with those of the Easterners would alone be sufficient to prove this point, provided of course that philologists were really capable of understanding the spirit of the languages they studied. On the other hand, Easterners show a strongly marked tendency to disregard applications. This is quite understandable, because anyone who above everything else cultivates the knowledge of universal principles can only take a lukewarm interest in the special sciences, bestowing upon them at the most a passing curiosity, which would anyway be unlikely to call forth a large number of discoveries in this order of ideas. For Easterners, there's clearly no point in pursuing experimental sciences for their own sake, and from the metaphysical point of view, they only possess an incidental and contingent value, like the objects they are applied to. Another point that should not be overlooked, and that appears as a corollary of what has gone before, is that no one in the world has ever shown less inclination than the Easterners to follow the cult of nature, as it was followed in Greco-Roman times, since for them nature has always meant the world of appearances. Appearances no doubt possess a reality of their own, but it is only transitory and impermanent, contingent, and not universal. Therefore, to men who are metaphysicians by temperament, naturalism, in the many guises it is capable of assuming, only appears as an aberration, or even as an intellectual monstrosity. Thus, the fact that Easterners never devoted themselves to certain special branches of science is in no wise a sign of inferiority. From the intellectual point of view, indeed, it is quite the reverse, for it is nothing but the normal consequence of the fact that, in their case, their main activity was turned in another direction and toward totally different ends. It is precisely the different ways in which the mental activity of man can be exercised that stamp each civilization with its own particular character. Here also lies the explanation of the illusion of progress among those who, being acquainted with one kind of civilization only, can conceive of no other line of development than their own, believing it to be the only way possible, so that they take no account of the fact that a development in one sense may be largely counterbalanced by retrogression in another. Another interesting topic is that there exists a fairly widespread belief that relations between Greece and India did not begin, or rather did not assume appreciable importance until the time of Alexander's conquests. Whatever can be unmistakably assigned to an earlier date is therefore simply put down to casual resemblances between the two civilizations, while anything which arose or is supposed to have arisen later is naturally said to be the result of Greek influence, to meet the requirements of the peculiar logic inherent in the classical prejudice. The fact that the earliest of the Greek philosophers lived several centuries before the period of Alexander does not in any way authorize us to conclude that they know nothing about the Hindu doctrines. To quote one example, atomism, long before it appeared in Greece, was upheld in India by the school of Kannada, and later by Jains and Buddhists. It is possible that it was brought to the West by Phoenicians, as certain traditions seem to suggest, but on the other hand, various authors declare that Democritus, who was one of the first of the Greeks to adopt this doctrine, or at least to formulate it clearly, had traveled in Egypt, Persia, and India. The early Greek philosophers may even have been acquainted not only with the Hindu, but also with the Buddhist doctrines, for they certainly did not live earlier than Buddhism. Furthermore, Buddhism soon spread outside India into Asiatic regions lying nearer to Greece, which were therefore more accessible. This circumstance would appear to strengthen the argument, which is quite a tenable one, that borrowings were made chiefly, though not exclusively, from the Buddhist civilization. What is curious in any case is that the points of resemblance which can be established with the doctrines of India are much more striking and numerous in the pre-Socratic age than in subsequent periods. What then becomes of the part played by the conquest of Alexander in the intellectual relations of the two peoples? They do not, in fact, appear to have introduced any Hindu influences, except that contained in the logic of Aristotle and also in metaphysical part of the same philosopher's work, in which it is possible to point to intellectual affinities with India far too close to be purely accidental. If, with the object of safeguarding the originality of the Greek philosophers at all cost, the objection is put forward that there exists an intellectual fund common to all humanity, it is nonetheless true that the existence of this fund is something too general and vague to provide a satisfactory explanation for likenesses that are both close and clearly defined. Differences of mentality in many cases go much further than is supposed by those who have only known one human type. Between Greeks and Hindus especially, these differences were considerable. Such an explanation only holds good when it is a question of two comparable civilizations that have developed in the same direction, though independently of one another, producing conceptions that are fundamentally the same, however unlike they may appear in form. This is the case with the metaphysical doctrines of China and India. But even within these limits, it would perhaps be more convincing to recognize in this concordance the results of an identity of primordial traditions, as one is obliged to do, for example, in cases where a common use of the same symbols is observable. After Aristotle, the signs of Hindu influence on Greek philosophy become more and more rare, even to the point of disappearing, because that philosophy shut itself up in an increasingly limited and contingent sphere, ever further removed from any real intellectuality. And this sphere was, for the most part, that of ethics, which is concerned with questions that have always been quite foreign to the Orientals. It was only among the Neoplatonists that Eastern influences were again to make their appearance, and it is there, indeed, that certain metaphysical ideas, such as that of the infinite, are to be met with for the first time among the Greeks. Until then, in fact, the Greeks had only possessed the notion of indefinite, and finished and perfect were synonymous terms for them. For the Orientals, on the contrary, it is the infinite which is identical with perfection. Among the most of Orientalists, however, there is noticeable common tendency to try and discount the antiquity of these civilizations they are dealing with, as far as they possibly can, often beyond all reason, as if they feel embarrassed by the fact that these civilizations had been able to exist and were already in a full state of development in such remote ages, long before the earliest origins that can be claimed for our present civilization, or rather for those civilizations from which it is directly derived. This seems to be the only excuse for their preconceived ideas on the subject. Moreover, the same bias has been allowed to affect things much closer to the West in every respect than the civilizations of China and India, or even Egypt, Persia and Chaldea. Thus, for instance, an attempt was made to advance the date of the Hebraic Kabbalah in such a manner as to suggest that Alexandrian and Neoplatonist influences had been at work there, whereas it was certainly the opposite that took place. The reason for this confusion resides, as usual, in the fact that it is agreed a priori that everything must have come from the Greeks, that it is the Greeks who held the monopoly of knowledge in antiquity, just as the Westerners imagine themselves to possess it today, and that they were the appointed educators of humanity, just as the same Europeans claim to be at the present moment. Nevertheless, Plato, whose evidence ought not to be doubted in this connection, was not afraid of recording in his Timaeus that the Egyptians looked on the Greeks as children. Orientals today could still find ample reasons for saying as much about the Westerners, were it not that an almost excessive politeness has often prevented them from going to such lengths. Anyone who feels that we unduly belittle the part played by the Greeks by presenting them entirely in the part of adapters, might object that we are not acquainted with all their ideas and that there are many things that have not come down to us. In certain aspects, no doubt, this is true, particularly as regards to the oral teachings of the philosophers. But is not what we do now of their ideas amply sufficient to enable us to judge of the remainder? Analogy, which is our only available means of proceeding to a certain extent from the known to the unknown, cannot but bear us out. Moreover, according to the written teachings we possess, there are at least strong reasons for supposing that the corresponding oral teaching, precisely insofar as it contained something special and esoteric, that is to say something of a more inward nature, was even more strongly inspired by the Orient, to which it must in many ways have been related. Indeed, the very inwardness of that teaching cannot but provide a confirmation of the fact that it had remained nearer to its sources and was less deformed than the other teachings of the time, because it had been less adapted to the general mentality of the Greek people. Otherwise, its comprehension would clearly not have demanded a special training, above all a training so long and arduous as that, for example, in force in the Pythagorean schools. Besides, archaeologists and Orientalists would hardly be in a position to contradict us by invoking an oral teaching or even lost works, since the historical method of which they are so enamored has, as its essential characteristic, the consideration only of monuments that can be seen and of documents that can be handled. And it is here precisely that we see the historical method revealed in all its insufficiency. There is yet another fact which the partisans of the historical method could hardly take into account without finding themselves in disagreement with their own tenets. It is that oral teaching almost everywhere preceded written teaching, and that it has been the only method of teaching in use for periods of possibly very long duration, though it may be difficult to determine their exact length. In a general way, and in most instances, a traditional text is no more than a recording, at a relatively recent date, of a teaching which was originally transmitted by word of mouth, and to which an author can rarely be assigned. Thus, even were one entirely certain of being in a possession of the original manuscript, though there is perhaps actually no recorded case of this having happened, it would still be necessary to know for how long the previous oral transmission had continued, and this question is likely, far oftener than not, to remain unanswered. The most serious difficulties standing in the way of any correct interpretation of Oriental doctrines are those arising from the essential differences between Eastern and Western ways of thinking. The difference naturally shows itself in a corresponding difference between the languages destined to express the respective modes of thought, and thus another difficulty, derived from the first, arises when it comes to rendering certain ideas in the languages of the West, which are deficient in the appropriate terms and are, above all, metaphysically expressive only in a very small degree. Moreover, this is but an aggravation of the difficulties that attend every attempt at translation, and which are still to be met with, though in a less acute form, when passing from one language to another, one that is closely related to it both philologically and geographically. Even in the latter case, terms that are considered to be synonymous, and which often have a common origin and derivation, are nevertheless in many cases very far from offering an exact equivalence of meaning. This is quite understandable, for it is evident that every language must be specially adapted to the mentality of the people speaking it, and each people has its own mental makeup, which differs more or less widely from that of other peoples. When we speak of the separation of peoples, and consequently of their languages, it must also be noticed that this can be a separation in time as well as space, so that the foregoing remarks apply with equal force to the understanding of ancient languages. Indeed, even in the case of single people, if it should happen that its mental outlook undergoes considerable modifications in the course of its history, not only do new terms come to take the place of older ones in its language, but also the meaning of those terms that remain varies proportionally to the mental changes. This is so true that even where a language remains almost unchanged in its outward form, the same words really cease to correspond to the same concepts, so that a real translation becomes necessary in order to restore this sense by substituting quite different words for words that nevertheless still remain in use. A comparison between the English of the 17th century and that of our day would provide us with many examples. It can be said that any expression of a thought is necessarily imperfect in itself, for it limits and cramps the conception by enclosing it with a definite form, which can never hope to be completely adequate, inasmuch as a conception always contains something that surpasses its expression. This applies with still greater force when metaphysical conceptions are in question, which always require a due allowance to be made for the inexpressible, since it is in their very essence to open the door to limitless possibilities. The passage from one language to another language, less suited in its nature to such purposes, can indeed only heighten the original and unavoidable defect. But once one has to some extent succeeded in grasping the conceptions itself through its original expression, by identifying oneself as far as possible with the mental outlook of the person whose thoughts it represents, it is evident that one can always make up largely for this disadvantage by resorting to an interpretation which, if it is to be intelligible, will have to be a commentary rather than a literal translation, pure and simple. Fundamentally, therefore, the real difficulty is the mental assimilation needed to arrive at this result. There are certainly many minds that are quite incapable of it, and it is easy to gauge how far this effort transcends the scope of mere works of erudition. There is only one really profitable way of studying doctrines. In order to be understood, they must be studied, so to speak, from the inside, whereas the Orientalists have always confined themselves to an investigation from the outside. The kind of study referred to is, relatively speaking, easier in the case of doctrines that have been handed down regularly to the present day, and which still possess their authorized interpreters, that in the case of teachings that have only come down to us in a written or symbolic form, unaccompanied by the oral tradition that has long since died out. It is all the more regrettable that Orientalists, through a prejudice that may have been partially involuntary, but for that very reason all the more invincible, have always persisted in neglecting this help that is open to them, to those at least who embark on the study of still extant civilizations, if not to those others whose researches are concerned with extant civilizations. Nevertheless, as we have already explained in earlier context, even the latter, the Egyptologists and Asinologists, for example, could certainly spare themselves many misunderstandings if they possessed a wider knowledge of the human mind and of the various modalities that it can assume. But it is just this knowledge that can only be acquired by a genuine study of the Eastern doctrines, which could thus render the greatest service to the study of antiquity in all its branches, at least indirectly. However, even with this object in view, something more is demanded than to bury oneself under an erudition which has little to offer in any case. But this is doubtless the only field in which those who are unable to escape from the narrow limitations of the modern Western mentality find that they can exercise their activity without having to face too many awkward difficulties. It is this, we repeat once again, that constitutes the fundamental reason why the works of Orientalists are utterly inadequate for bringing about the comprehension of any idea whatsoever, and they are at the same time useless, if not in some cases actually harmful, as a means towards promoting an intellectual understanding between East and West.